Hello, welcome to Sport Unlocked. If you hit subscribe, we land in your pod feed automatically, and you can follow us and message us on X, Facebook, Instagram at Sport Unlocked. As we end the year, one huge story for the pod, the fallout from the Super League verdict. We'll tell you what it all means with some EU legal expertise from Miguel Maduro, the former FIFA governance chief. We'll also hear from him on Gianni Infantino's FIFA presidency. We will also reflect on the Women's World Cup fallout as we end 2023 with Ebru Köksal, the chair of Women in Football. Joining me, Rob Harris from Sky News as ever, Martyn Ziegler from The Times, briefly, Tariq Panja from the New York Times, and also with us, Graham Dunbar from the Associated Press, who is in Saudi Arabia at the Club World Cup. And we do have to start with that. Graham, what's it been like out there?
It's been interesting. Second year in a row, we've been in the Middle East in 30-degree temperatures in the days running up to what would be Christmas in Europe. But it's interesting to see that Saudi football and society and the city of Jeddah at the very start of the journey to the World Cup, which is 11 years away. I think we can be fairly sure that's exactly where the 2034 World Cup will be. There's obvious comparisons with where Qatar was at the same point in the journey, a decade out of its World Cup. So yeah, it's been a fascinating place to be here. I'm not sure there have been enough fans here to fully test the city and the logistics, but it's definitely been a good exercise for everyone concerned.
We'll get back to more of that later on, but only one place to start. That verdict from the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, ruling that UEFA has an unfair monopoly, abusing its dominant market position in terms of trying to stop those clubs who attempted the Super League rebellion in April 2021. This a case launched by those still holding on, the two Klingons to the Super League, Real Madrid and Barcelona, but under the A22 guise.
I think this is one of the most significant weeks in football for many, many years. I think the ramifications are probably going to spill out over months, years to come. I think the European Super League ruling by the ECJ is going to perhaps shift the power balance in ways that we may not even know yet. I also think it's significant, the Club World Cup being in Saudi Arabia, the FIFA summit there. It's the sort of increasing the hold that Saudi Arabia seems to have on the world game.
And a hold perhaps on all of sport. It can seem the centre of world sport at the moment, Saudi Arabia. It's been one of the themes, obviously, of the year on Sport Unlocked. And great, Martyn, that you could maintain your 100% appearance record, I think, by being on all 133 episodes of the pod. But all the time you've got for us today at a very busy time of year. But it's been an important news week, so good to get your thoughts on the Super League.
I really look forward to listening to what you guys, Tariq, Rob, and our guest, Graham Dunbar, make of it all.
So, Tariq, who are the winners? Certainly both sides are claiming victory.
Who are the winners? Maybe both sides are losers. Is it fair? Could that be possible? It was, the headline was quite grabbing. It was funny, from something staid like a European Court of Justice to, it felt a bit kind of screechy tabloidy, the way it came out, essentially saying FIFA and UEFA were acting unlawfully. It kind of was very attention grabbing, wasn't it? And then you delve into the 60-odd pages of the ruling, and like with most things, there was a bit of nuance. But I think, UEFA were presenting it as like, we're glad this has come out, and, it just kind of backs us up. We just need to do a little bit of trimming around the edges. I'm not so sure it's just that. I think it's a rebuke of how UEFA and FIFA basically were allowed themselves to think they could do whatever they wanted. I don't think that's true. So they're on watch now. And as far as A22 are concerned, that group claiming, this monopoly is over, the Super League is coming, it really isn't, is it? You kind of saw that, Rob, in the reaction from the clubs, the stakeholder groups, and I think a lot more needs to unravel. Could anybody else bring a tournament on the table? It doesn't have to be A22. Could the clubs take over?
Where do you think it leaves UEFA's power in all this? For Alexander Shefrin, for the clubs as well, and for the fact, will we get the Super League threat dangled in future forevermore, knowing that it might be harder to punish them?
Yeah, I think that threat's kind of always there. I don't want to call it Super League anymore. It feels like something in the future. It just gives more chance, and I think the clubs do come out more powerful. What I probably think will happen, maybe the clubs will ask for a majority of control, not this 49-51 in UEFA's favour of club football. I think the next year is going to be interesting, isn't it? Like, let's see. I think there's going to be more legal battles, that's for sure. It does diminish UEFA in some ways when they're branded as unlawful. I just can't, think that's a good thing. It wasn't a good day for UEFA when you see Europe's calling you unlawful. I don't know, Rob. They did suggest it was finally a line under this, but it's not great, is it?
Graham, you've been following the sports law process for long enough, based in Switzerland, covering all the governing bodies. Did we expect it to come down so hard against UEFA, and how much of a defeat was it for them?
I think we expected UEFA to make some concessions, but I think given what the original opinion was a year ago, which is very much in UEFA's favour, I think it was perhaps surprising that it was so, on the face of it, such a big defeat for UEFA. But when you get into more of the detail, the fine print, the nuance, and the practicalities of where the clubs are these days compared to where they were nearly 3 years ago, I don't think it's quite as apocalyptic as it might have appeared in the first minutes and hours when we were digesting the news on Thursday.
Certainly, the UEFA president, Alexander Shefrin, didn't seem too concerned, very dismissive of A22 as he spoke at a virtual news conference.
I'm so happy that we saw the presentation and that it's clear now that they are offering a close competition, which we knew all the time, but they tried to present publicly it's not true. I've seen today the press release of English supporters who call it the Zombie League. They didn't use that. They used Blue League and some other colors as well. But despite that, we will not try to stop them. Even before, we never tried to stop them. And we said that, even I said that publicly many times. They can create whatever they want. I hope that they start their fantastic competition as soon as possible with two clubs. I hope they know what they're doing, which I'm not so sure about.
UEFA President Alexander Shefrin there on the A22 plans for a 3-tier competition. After the first season, you could only enter by qualifying somehow for the third tier and have to climb your way through, rather than now where you can qualify to the Champions League through your domestic leagues. We will analyse that more later. Graham, what did you make of Shefrin's demeanour? There was scorn and sarcasm.
I think this plays to his strengths. I think over the 7 years of his UEFA presidency, he's been at his most effective when he's been campaigning against something, when he's putting up barriers to projects, whether that's biennial World Cup or the massive World Cup project of years ago. And it seems to bring out the best in him when he's got an opponent to defy. And it seems to whether it's for his personality or because he's a lawyer at heart, he feels good to be in a fight. And this is obviously potentially an existential fight for UEFA's control of the Champions League, given the directions this case could go. So I think it gave him an opportunity to rise to the challenge, like it did 2.5 years ago, where he was an effective defender of UEFA in rallying support from politicians and football against the original project. So I think, yes, this would have been one of his better days in what's been a difficult year for him as UEFA president.
Tariq, good for you to get a chance to hear from Alexander Shefrin. You raised that point with him.
We've had so few chances with getting these presidents in a press conference situation. It took the ECJ judgment to finally get Alexander Shefrin and the other football leaders to kind of speak. So we made that point that it was nice to see him.
And of course, he benefits from having his voice heard, as did all of them on there, as a sort of say, no harm came from sort of speaking to the media, and it gave him a more prominent voice, whereas some of others within the sport who spoke out just with written statements, their sort of views vaguely sort of faded away, didn't they?
Absolutely. It gives life to this situation. Don't forget, like, as Gianni Infantino loves to say, football is emotion and all the rest of it. and it gives these guys a chance to express their emotion. This is quite high stakes stuff, isn't it? It's the future of football. These are people running it. I think the public want to hear from them as much as we do.
We did hear from Gianni in a written statement, and in it was quite cautious, wasn't it? I didn't view it as an outright sort of condemnation in any way of the Super League. He said, with the greatest respect for the European Court of Justice, today's judgment does not change anything really. And then there was just words really in there. And it comes off the back of him actually supporting a closed competition very publicly with the African Football League that launched this year with 8 teams selected to participate, and A1, isn't he?
Yeah. If you ask Javier Tebas who A1 is, that famous code name given in the Super League documents, a lot of people are convinced that, at least some people felt, they had the backing in some way of Gianni Infantino or of FIFA in some way, or FIFA wouldn't really object if it got through. Because if you think about it, it wouldn't be that damaging to FIFA and Gianni Infantino's aspirations to have these regional big Super Leagues, and maybe they would funnel into why not a Club World Cup, maybe 32 teams. There you go, Rob. But it's interesting. Football doesn't always have to stay the same, does it? I suppose new ideas are welcome. It's that if you can have conversations, a spirit of transparency, have everyone involved, and it's for the benefit of football rather than someone with a bag of cash or a few elite clubs.
Well, for an additional insight now, let's bring into the conversation Miguel Maduro, the former chair of the FIFA Governance Committee, also a one-time minister in the Portuguese government, and, crucially for this conversation, an expert in EU law. Miguel, welcome to Sport Unlocked. How much of a blow was this verdict to UEFA?
They didn't probably expect this result. Many people thought that the decision will be more favorable towards UEFA. I think particularly, though, in terms of the law, they are nothing particularly new. I think what is relevant is that the tone that the court uses and the scrutiny that it requires regarding future decisions by sports organizing bodies, and in particular international federations such as FIFA, puts them under an additional scrutiny. And to a certain extent requires them to reform their governance methods, and opens to also some competition with respect to the events that they organize. So the court makes it clear that the only way for sports federations to maintain their commercial role, in addition to their regulatory and licensing role, is if they demonstrate, and this is going to be reviewed by courts, if they demonstrate that the competitions that they organize are actually more appropriate to fulfill the goals that are recognized by the court itself as justifying some specificity for sports, such as merit.
What goals justify this?
The court talks about sports merit, equal opportunities to compete. The court also talks about redistribution across the different levels, talks about the open character of competitions and promotion relegation, and talks about solidarity that justify recognizing the role of sports organizations, but at the same time also puts under pressure, because it says you can only use the authority that you are claiming to use if you are actually using it to pursue these goals, and if you demonstrate that your competitions do it.
If a third party says, I can meet all of these criteria, here I want to be authorized to run a tournament, what happens next?
They will go to the sports federation to have that authorized, basically, that competition. And if they decline to authorize the competition, they can go to court.
Okay.
And national courts within the European Union. And they can basically forum shopping. The first thing they can do is that they can forum shopping whichever jurisdiction they think may be more amiable to their arguments. And then basically the UEFA, for example, if we're talking about UEFA or any other sports federation, will have to demonstrate that this competition is less appropriate, less apt to pursue those goals than the competitions that the sports federation itself is organizing.
That still puts the sports organization in a strong position that it's writing the rules. It can then come up with a tournament, a format, Champions League, if you like. It's still very powerful, the role UEFA has as event organizer, potentially, and definitely the authorizer or the regulator. So that's been maintained somewhat.
Yeah, so the court does recognize that the specificity of sport allows to maintain the pyramid structure within sports that places at the top of the structure international sports federations and recognizes their regulatory and licensing role. But the court imposes two very strong constraints on that power. And the first one is with respect to the regulatory and licensing power, they can only use it if they set up a framework of what the court calls substantive and procedural rules that guarantees that they are not going to use that regulatory and licensing role in an arbitrary, non-transparent, discriminatory manner that favors, for example, their own competitions. This is the first constraint. But the second is even if first they need to meet this standard, that is a very demanding standard, I think, and we can talk about that. But then the second aspect is that even if they meet that standard and therefore they can keep that role, and what the court said, by the way, is that the UEFA currently does not meet that standard. But if it will meet that standard, even in that case, if someone comes with a competition that they can demonstrate before a court that is actually more appropriate to pursue the goals that the court recognizes as legitimate roles and specific of sports, then the competition that the federation itself is organizing, then that competition needs to be authorized.
UEFA will say, well, this case started before we updated our authorization rules, which they did in 2022. That's like a 16-page circular letter. If those authorization rules can be challenged now as well.
Yes, of course they can. I mean, the first thing is that any new request for authorization, it will have to be subject to independent review. That's what's one of the conditions, and will have to meet the standards that the court develops further in this judgment. And therefore, if UEFA declines to authorize that, anyone can challenge it both on two grounds. The first one is that the authorization procedure does not meet, in terms of substantive and procedural rules, the requirements of the judgment. That's the first challenge. The second one is, even if it will meet that, they can challenge it by saying my competition is actually better than the competition than the Champions League in pursuing the goals that are the goals recognized.
Who is it can decide? Are you saying that a judge in Spain or Lisbon will say to someone, actually, your competition is better than that one? Let me ask you, what does the judge know about that? How can they say, subjectively, your offer is better than someone else's?
Well, as the courts have to decide these things on many issues on which they are not technical experts. They will decide based on the evidence that both parties will produce. I mean, competition law is about that, and that's what the court says. The court actually goes, it's surprisingly more than in other sports cases, into a lot of detail on requiring the national courts to really go into depth into the evidence and say, well, the federations have to demonstrate that really it's not more beneficial for consumers, the alternative competitive models that are being put forward. So, but let me tell you something, because this is important. What I think that the risk that this creates is because this is going to be decided at the level of national courts, and therefore there's a risk of forum shopping. There's a reason why the Super League was established in Madrid, is because they think that the Madrid judge may be more favorable to their arguments. There's a risk of fragmentation. This may be the incentive necessary for the EU political process to intervene and legislate and create a framework in order to prevent the risks of fragmentation through diverging national decisions in this respect. So this may be the trigger for for the political process to create a regulatory framework for sports international federations in Europe.
something we haven't touched on yet. There were other verdicts. What about the homegrown player rule verdict, ruling in favour of Antwerp? What was all that about? And have we actually missed the more significant ruling in terms of all the post-match analysis from the court?
Well, I think that that was not surprising to me, because the court basically leaves it, the final decision, to the Belgium court. It's important to say this, but leaves it without a big margin of appreciation. Basically, because the court basically alerts to the Belgium court to say, well, we can accept rules that are aimed at favoring the training of investing in the training of players. But he says, if a rule is not rewarding clubs that themselves are investing in the training of players, but by allowing them to, by imposing a minimum number of players train at the specific club, but instead talks about clubs train in any national club, then this is a rule that discriminates on the basis of nationality instead of favoring locally trained players at the level of the clubs. Because what the court says very clear, I mean, any big club can come and buy players from other Belgium teams, and therefore this is not a real incentive for them to invest in their homegrown players. It's an incentive to protect national players, and I think therefore the court is quite correct in my view. But the court makes it clear that if a rule is designed in such a way that incentivizes clubs to invest in their own trained players, that will be acceptable. If instead claims to be doing that when in fact it's favoring domestic players, that's not the case.
It's a great ruling in a sense. Fans of teams like to see players who have come through their local academy. What does that mean? Trained in their club, not bought to their club, having been trained somewhere else nationally. So, for example, Manchester United fans will like players who've come through the Manchester United academy and not been formed in Arsenal or Liverpool or elsewhere. And that's what training is, right? And Miguel Sporting Club de Portugal, a club that trains a lot of players. You're a season ticket holder, a big fan of that club. You must love it.
The best players in the world, basically, have been trained at Sporting.
One final point, we've got you on, Miguel. Graham's also on from Saudi Arabia. We last spoke straight after FIFA effectively awarded Saudi Arabia the 2034 World Cup. You were there inside FIFA for a period, well, right at the start of the Gianni Infantino presidency.
A very short period, but but a period indeed. Very active, but short.
Yeah. What are your reflections now further on that whole process that's led to effectively Saudi Arabia being awarded the 2034 World Cup, that process that combined the 6 countries for 2030 with no big say of the Congress, all behind closed doors? FIFA will say it's a sensible way of aligning different countries, getting the World Cup being spread out around the world. But what do you think it tells you about where FIFA are now? Sort of, what are we, 7 years into the Gianni Infantino presidency?
They didn't really spread it across the world. They made it sure that it will go to Saudi Arabia by also giving some matches to South America, to basically making one World Cup taking place in South America, Europe, and Africa, to then be able to give the other one to Saudi Arabia. So if anything, they concentrated in regional terms. They haven't dispersed it and diversified. But I cannot say I am disappointed, because unfortunately my hopes, my expectations were not very high at this point, that FIFA would stay committed to the reform process that was initiated in late 2015 and in 2016. And I think this is simply a confirmation of that. The way this World Cup was attributed is the exact opposite of what had been promised in 2016. That was a transparent process, a really inclusive process, and instead it was a backroom deal that was clearly agreed in advance, and then all the rules were manipulated to make sure that the World Cup was going to be awarded to Saudi Arabia. So I can only say this confirms that reforms will only happen if they are going to be imposed from the outside.
Miguel, thank you for joining us. Miguel Maduro, former FIFA governance
Thank you.
chief. Good to get your insight. And of course, if FIFA do want to come on to offer another view, they are always welcome. And you can listen back to our pod from October with FIFA Vice President Victor Montagliani, the CONCACAF President too. And before we return to analysing that Super League verdict and what comes next, we did want to reflect on one of the big issues for FIFA over the last year and UEFA, the fallout from the World Cup final in Sydney and that non-consensual kiss on Jenny Hermoso, the Spanish World Cup winner, by the then UEFA Vice President Luis Rubiales. And we discussed it with our guest last week on the pod, Ebru Köksal. We didn't include it then, but here is something I asked Ebru last week. She, of course, is the chair of Women in Football, as well as a former Galatasaray board member and someone who's had many governance positions within football. Here's what I asked her. Looking at the bigger picture, has that forced any change that you've seen going around the game? Any better respect shown towards women? Any greater recognition from perhaps some of the men you might have encountered issues with to realise that conduct is wrong? Has that moment changed anything, do you think, more widely across the women's game?
Look, we have, as you well remember, launched an open doors campaign after the incident because we said this is really a governance issue. And many of the governing bodies or member associations are not necessarily well managed, in the sense that the election process usually produces very similar people sitting on those boards. And we just need to make sure that there is a robust and transparent selection process, and ideally including, FIFA, UEFA, and all the member associations to have some independent board members. There's so much talent out there who's not necessarily coming from the ranks of the football politics, but they can contribute a lot and bring a fresh perspective into the organization. So it's very important that, very similar to England, right? The English FA Premier League, they have picked amazing chairs recruited through executive search firms, and they're both doing an amazing job. But more importantly, I think when the disciplinary proceedings, the detailed report was announced, I was like, yes, this is what I was saying from the very beginning, which is this whole incident has actually tarnished the value of FIFA Women's World Cup, right? And the sponsors and the broadcasters should be also complaining, because instead of talking about how successful the whole World Cup was, everyone for the next month kept only talking about this incident. So I think, once again, we need to keep in mind that value, and especially brand value, is very closely tied to governance.
Ebru Köksal there, the chair of Women in Football. Returning to the Super League now, and in fact we did get the first plans from the A22 company this week for women's football. Previously they'd been pretty vague, but now they say they'll introduce a two-tier competition, much like UEFA will have as well, with their introduction of a new second-tier knockout competition. But Graham, returning to you, there are no signs of other clubs signing up, are there, apart from Real Madrid and Barcelona, who are behind A22. Where do you think things head from here with A22 and their whole strategy?
I think in their minds, A22 are like, the Wizard of Oz and all this, but perhaps more realistically, they're just like a bloke behind the curtain. I mean, they've brought this case and they've put the debate into the Luxembourg court. But whether they're the people that will ultimately benefit from this down the line is a whole different thing. Yes, the door is open to some kind of project in the future, but whether you think they will be the ones driving it, or whether it actually is handed more power and authority to the ECA, which has got the clubs on side much more than they did 3 years ago, and is obviously a close working partner with UEFA and has got a stronger memorandum of understanding, a working agreement with FIFA. Maybe it's the ECA that comes out of this as the center of a future project, and not A22, which, okay, they brought the case, but what actual remit do they have in all this?
Tariq, is that now it? The power of the clubs grown throughout all this? Nasser Al-Khelaifi rising to the top of European football as ECA chair, given that he benefited from Andrea Agnelli, the Juventus chair at the time, running the ECA, but having to step down because he was part of that rebellion in 2021. And will we still see the threat of a Super League dangled, or have the clubs actually got what they want?
Yeah, it's an unusual and curious ascent for Nasser Al Khalifi you described there, Rob. And that's probably a broader conversation for another day. But yeah, the big winners here for me are the clubs. They've got this joint venture that UEFA has promised them. There was supposed to be a company. Graham is aware of this perhaps more than anyone. He lives in Switzerland. There's supposed to be a company that was set up. We still haven't seen that. We still haven't seen a chief executive for this joint venture or any staff. I think what we're going to see is that effort from the clubs be made more forcefully. I think is more power to the clubs. Is that fair, Graham?
I think so. I think things don't happen without their consent. If you can't put these teams on the pitch, you don't have a competition.
And they have choices right now. UEFA has the role as an authorizer of any competition, but it doesn't have a sole monopoly on being the only game in town. Should a series of criteria be met, anyone could bring a new tournament offer to the table, whether it's clubs or promoters or anybody else, not just UEFA or FIFA.
Yeah, I mean, I almost wondered if A22 should have just presented quite a very staid proposal, almost like the Champions League that's going to disappear from this season when it becomes the Swiss model next year. Put something that looks reasonable, and then down the line, once you've got in a very potential scenario, you've signed all the clubs up, then you make it into this closed competition. But that's the issue with their new format, this 3-tier format, isn't it? I mean, first of all, what about those names of the leagues? We'd have the top league as the Star League. Then we've got I'm trying to remember now, what is it? Gold League? Then Blue
League.
What was the second league?
To be honest with you, the fact we can't remember, it just shows, again, the paucity of maybe that idea and that marketing element of whatever it is they were doing. Maybe something similar. You're right, Rob.
And of course, one of the issues is the fact that we don't know how entry would be gained into that third tier, but you could only enter into the third tier. Once you've locked in at the start of the whole competition, you'd be there at the top potentially for years to come. So it does prevent that ability to sort of dare to dream. Aston Villa, for instance, riding high in the Premier League this season, would they even, well, they wouldn't get into the top tier at all of this men's competition.
Well, it would make it a lot more difficult because, as you said, we don't know how the teams that are outside of those three divisions, if you win your league, if there's a Leicester situation or a Villa you mentioned, if they win the Premier League, not inconceivable, would they be allowed in, or is it a nationality limit? We don't know enough at all here, but it does smack of something we've seen before. The 2019 project proposed by former ECA president Andrea Agnelli and one Alexander Shefferin in 2019, Graham?
Absolutely. That's kind of where we came in on this debate in, I think March 2019. I was standing in the reception at UEFA waiting for the ECA and UEFA leaders to come out of a meeting downstairs where they were talking through this locked-in places, 24 carryover year by year, which put down the marker that the leagues and the middle-class clubs then rebelled against very effectively. And that that kind of idea is no more palatable now than it was then.
You said they rebelled. One of the biggest kind of people leading that rebellion was Javier Tebas of La Liga, if you remember at the time. I think he one of the first times he walked away from a UEFA committee was around that period. So it was really funny, guys, to see him at that press conference in the hours after the announcement from the ECJ, lining up alongside Alexander Shefferin and the other sort of football stakeholders, if you will.
Something else is the fact we have the La Liga president Javier Tebas backing Saudi Arabia. That wasn't the case previously at all. Tariq?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember being in a round table with him. I think you might have been there as well, Rob. In 2021, it might have been at one of those Financial Times conferences. And he really derided Saudi Arabia's efforts in football. He called it a textbook example of sports washing, if I remember correctly. and he talked about how he was not going to allow Al Maria, owned by Turkey Al Sheikh, a close ally of Mohammed bin Salman, to kind of bring Saudi wealth into the league and artificially inflate the teams. And now he has really changed his tune when it comes to Saudi Arabia. La Liga has a sponsorship deal with Saudi, and also he said maybe he was wrong in the past. He just needed to visit. Now he gets it.
Well, brings it back to the person visiting there as we record. Graham, one of the key things that we've seen as FIFA met there at the council brings it back to club football, this confirmation of the dates for the new Club World Cup. And I don't think people are realising the consequences of this new 32-team vast competition the summer of 2025 yet at all.
Yeah, it's sort of been a drip over the year. I don't know how many people realised until FIFA published the list of European clubs on something who have qualified. So this is going ahead without a significant number of the Super League clubs. There were 12 Super League clubs in 2021, and there will be 12 European teams in the Club World Cup when it relaunches in 2025. And there's not a lot of carryover there. Even Porto, Benfica will be at the Club World Cup. There won't be Liverpool. There won't be Manchester United, two of the most significant American-owned clubs. But that's what sporting merit is. Fundamentally we come back to. This should not be an invitation event. You should earn it on merit, on Champions League only results. Winning a couple of Europa Leagues doesn't help you. And that's what it is. And if we end up with Leipzig instead of Borussia Dortmund, Atletico Madrid against Barcelona, well, that's what happened on the pitch, and that's why those teams will be there for a very long time. A month in America, not 3 weeks as we thought, because there's this round of 16 being inserted. It's going to be as long as a 32-team World Cup. It's really quite a significant chunk of the summer of 2025 will be this new club tournament.
You said you have to earn it on merit and have your place there on sporting merit. Now, let me ask you this. Will Lionel Messi be playing in that tournament? Will Inter Miami be there? Because at the moment, what's the sporting merit for them being there?
Absolutely not. No, I don't see how they could be there, and nor would Al Nassr. Cristiano Ronaldo's team is not there unless they win the Asian Champions League this year. But yeah, those are the rules. That's what football is. There is jeopardy. Nothing is guaranteed.
The FIFA Council, last one of Fatah Samoura's Secretary General, how FIFA been out there. Not heard much from Gianni Infantino beyond his Insta videos. He's had a bit of media chat. He's been playing the Legends game. Certainly enjoyed those.
No, it's very much a kind of modern FIFA meeting. Lots on see where he is on Instagram. No press conference, no availability, almost no opportunity to speak with him when you see him at the hotel. But yeah, decisions made, and 150 member associations flew in for a closed doors meeting. What they discussed, we don't exactly know.
But Graham, those summits, if you remember, Gianni Infantino, when he came in 2016, he said, and they were quite a good idea. He was going to have these regional summits, but they were supposed to be for 20 FAs, 30 FAs at a time, so he can get to have a conversation with them, in small groups. If you invite all of FIFA to Saudi Arabia, how can you have those conversations, nuanced discussions? From the outside, it feels very much like a jolly. Come and stay in a nice hotel. If you fancy a Legends game, have a Legends game. Maybe do a bit of shopping, take in some football. Why not a show? Is it more than that?
It certainly felt like a good Saudi hosting, goodwill, building opportunity for all the European and South American and African member associations who maybe haven't here and are thinking, okay, well, this is our World Cup destination in 2034. We know the Saudis have signed a lot of MOUs with the members. There was a lot of connection we built. They've played a very good football diplomatic game in the last 4 years. And this was a logical opportunity. Come and see us, see how we're developing, because you're going to be building close relations with us in the future. So come and get to know us. Whether it was actually any use for football governance to sit in a room for 2 hours and listen to the World Cup final referee, listen to the Women's World Cup final referee, listen to Arsene Wenger. There's been a lot of listening and no real kind of exchange of best practice or working groups. But yeah, a nice place to be for a bit of a pre-Christmas break, for sure.
Sure, they've had a very nice time.
And it's been very nice to have you on too as well, Graham, and very nice to have everyone listening to us throughout the year as well on Sport Unlocked. So from all of us, thank you for listening. As ever, you can keep messaging us at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, sportunlockedpod@gmail.com. But for now, thank you to everyone and all enjoyed digesting that European Court of Justice ruling. For now, goodbye.